I thought building something together meant something. She said it was our dream, a small café. By the beach. I sold my truck. I used my pension. She drew the logo on a napkin and kissed me. And then one day, it opened with her and another man smiling behind the counter. My name wasn't even on the sign. The coffee was bitter that morning, but I didn't mind. I was sitting across from Roselyn at this tiny beachfront cafe in Dumaguete, watching her stir sugar into her cup with this concentrated look on her face. The morning sun was hitting her hair just right, making it shine like copper. She had this habit of tucking a strand behind her ear when she was thinking, and she was doing it now. "Sir E," she said, using that nickname that always made me smile. "What if we had our own place like this?" I looked around at the mismatched chairs and the hand-painted menu board. "What do you mean?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a napkin from the dispenser. "Like this, but better." Her pen moved across the thin paper, sketching what looked like a storefront with big windows and outdoor seating. Not too big, just cozy. Our little corner of the world. Something about the way she said "our" made my chest tighten in a good way. I'd been in the Philippines for 8 months now, and this was the first time anyone had included me in their future plans. Back in Colorado, after my brother died, I felt like I was just taking up space. Here, watching her draw, I felt needed again. "What would we call it?" I asked, leaning forward. She smiled and wrote Rosel's in cursive letters above the little cafe sketch. "Your name and mine. Together." The napkin was rough under my fingers when she slid it across to me. "Rose and Ellis," I said quietly. "Exactly." She reached across and touched my hand. "It won't be fancy, Sir E. Just good coffee, maybe some pastries. A place where people can sit and talk without rushing." She paused, looking out at the water. "I've been working for other people my whole life. I want something that's mine. Ours." I studied her face, the way her eyes got bright when she talked about dreams. At 61, I thought I was done with building things from scratch. I'd already raised 2 kids, watched them grow up and move away. I'd already put in 35 years as a fire inspector, seen enough burned buildings to last several lifetimes. But sitting there, holding that napkin, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. "How much would something like this cost?" I asked. She shrugged. "Not too much. Maybe $15,000 for the lease, renovation, equipment. I have some savings, and I know people who could help with the work." 15,000. That was less than half of what I'd gotten when I sold my truck before coming here. The rest was sitting in my savings account, earning nothing, waiting for me to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. "I could make this happen," I said. Her eyes widened. "Really? You would do that?" "We would do that," I corrected. "Partners, right?" She got up from her chair and came around to my side of the table, wrapping her arms around my shoulders from behind. "Thank you, Sir E. Thank you for believing in us." I folded the napkin carefully and put it in my wallet. That night, lying in bed, I took it out and looked at her drawing again, Rosel's. It had a nice ring to it. For the first time, since moving to the Philippines, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I never thought I'd be starting over at 61. When my brother Mike had his stroke, I was the one who found him. 3 days later, sitting in the funeral home making arrangements, I realized I was completely alone. My ex-wife had remarried years ago. My kids lived their own lives in other states. Mike was the last person who remembered me as anything other than a paycheck or a phone call on holidays. That's when I made the decision to sell everything. The house in Denver, the truck, most of my furniture. I kept a few photo albums and my tools, shipped them to a storage unit, and bought a one-way ticket to the Philippines. I'd visited once on vacation and liked the warmth. Not just the weather, but the way people actually talked to strangers instead of looking through them. I met Roselyn at a coffee stall near the university. She was working the morning shift, and I'd gotten into the habit of stopping by on my walks. She always remembered how I liked my coffee black, no sugar, and she'd ask about my day with genuine interest. Most of the other customers just ordered and left, but she made conversation. "You're American, right?" she asked one morning, wiping down the counter. "Colorado," I said. "Retired last year." "What did you do there?" "Fire inspector. Made sure buildings were safe." She nodded thoughtfully. "My father was a carpenter before he got sick. He always said buildings tell stories about the people who make them." That stuck with me. Over the weeks, our conversations got longer. She told me about growing up in a small town south of Dumaguete, how she'd moved to the city for work after high school. She was saving money to maybe start her own business someday, something in hospitality. She had this way of listening that made me feel like my stories mattered. "Why the Philippines, Suri?" she asked one day. Honestly, I was tired of being cold all the time, not just the weather. Everything felt cold. She smiled. And now, I wake up looking forward to things again. That was true. For the first time in years, I had reasons to get out of bed. Morning coffee with Roselyn. Walks along the boulevard. Learning enough Tagalog to have basic conversations with the neighbors. It wasn't much, but it was enough. When she showed me that napkin sketch, it felt like all the pieces were finally coming together. I had money sitting in the bank doing nothing. She had dreams and local knowledge and the energy to make things happen. It made perfect sense. "I've never had a business partner before," I told her that first day. "Neither have I," she said. "But I think we'll figure it out together." Looking back, I should have paid more attention to that word, together. Because apparently, we had very different ideas about what it meant. The next few weeks felt like being young again. Roselyn and I would meet every morning to plan our café. She brought notebooks filled with ideas, menu items, supplier contacts, color schemes. I brought my savings account statements and a practical approach to budgets. "We need to think about foot traffic," I said, spreading a map of Dumaguete across the table. "Location is everything." "I found a place," she said, pulling out her phone to show me photos. "It's on Real Street, close to the university. Students, tourists, locals, all walk by. The owner is asking $8,000 for a year lease, plus deposit." The space looked perfect in the pictures. Small but bright, with big windows facing the street and room for maybe 8 tables. There was even a small area out front where we could put outdoor seating. "What about renovations?" I asked. "My cousin Rico is a contractor. He can do the work for cost, maybe $3,000 total. Paint, some electrical work, new flooring." She paused, looking at her notes. "I also talked to my friend Maria, who works at that big hotel. She knows suppliers for coffee beans, pastries, all the basics." I was impressed by how much research she'd already done. "Sounds like you've thought of everything." "I've been dreaming about this for years, Suri. Now I finally have someone who can make it real." The way she said it, with such gratitude in her voice, made me feel like a hero. When was the last time someone had looked at me like I could solve their problems just by being there? "Okay," I said. "Let's do this properly. I'll transfer $12,000 to cover the lease, deposit, and renovations. That leaves us some cushion for equipment and initial inventory. You want to wire it to my account? Whatever works best. You know the local banking better than I do." She nodded, making notes in her notebook. "Rico wants to start next week, if we can get him the deposit. And Maria says the best time to open is before the semester starts, when students are looking for new places to study." Everything was moving fast, but it felt right. I was finally using my savings for something meaningful, instead of just letting it sit there. That afternoon, I went to the bank and arranged the wire transfer to Roselyn's account. "Big investment?" the teller asked. "Business venture," I said. "A cafe. Here in Dumaguete? With my partner. We're going to call it Rosel's." The teller smiled. "That's a nice name. Good luck, sir." Walking back to meet Roselyn, I felt lighter than I had in years. I was building something again, with someone who appreciated what I brought to the table. At my age, I thought those opportunities were behind me. "It's done," I told Roselyn when I found her at our usual coffee spot. "The money should be in your account tomorrow." She jumped up and hugged me right there in front of everyone. "Thank you, Suri. You won't regret this. We're going to build something beautiful together." I believed her completely. Why wouldn't I? 3 weeks into the renovation, I started noticing things. Small things at first. Roselyn would take longer to answer my calls, sometimes not calling back until the next day. When I asked how the work was going, she'd give vague answers. "Rico's making good progress," she'd say. "But you know how construction is, always something unexpected." "Can I see it?" I asked one afternoon. "I'd love to check on how things are coming along." "Oh, it's such a mess right now, Suri. Dust everywhere, tools scattered around. Maybe next week when it's more presentable?" Next week turned into the week after that. Then she started saying Rico needed more money for materials, an extra 1,000 here, 500 there. When I asked for receipts, she looked hurt. "You don't trust me?" she said, her voice quiet. Of course I trust you. I just like to keep track of expenses. Old habit from work. I understand, but Rico doesn't always give formal receipts. He's family, you know. We operate more on trust. I felt like an ass for questioning her. Here she was, working hard to make our dream real, and I was acting like some suspicious accountant. So I transferred the additional money without asking more questions. But the questions kept building in my head. When I'd suggest meeting for coffee, she'd often say she was too busy with cafe preparations. When I'd ask specific questions about suppliers or equipment, she'd change the subject or say she was still figuring things out. I want to be involved, I told her one evening. This is supposed to be our project together. And it is, Sir. But I know how things work here. It's better if I handle the local stuff and you focus on the big picture. The big picture. What was my role supposed to be besides writing checks? One morning, I decided to walk by the cafe location myself. I'd driven past it when Roselyn first showed me, but I'd never actually stopped to look closely. The address was easy enough to find on Real Street. When I got there, the windows were covered with brown paper, and there was no sign of any construction activity. No tools outside, no workers coming or going. The door was locked, and when I peered through a gap in the paper, the space looked empty. I stood there for 20 minutes, watching for any sign of Rico or his crew. Nothing. A woman from the shop next door came out and looked at me curiously. "Excuse me," I said in my broken Tagalog. "The cafe here, when do the workers come?" She looked confused. "What cafe? This place has been empty for months." My stomach dropped. "But there's supposed to be renovation happening. For a coffee shop." She shook her head. "I haven't seen any workers. Are you sure you have the right address?" I showed her the photos on my phone that Roselyn had taken. She looked at them, then at the storefront, then back at me with a concerned expression. "I'm sorry, sir, but nothing has been happening here." I walked back to my apartment in a daze. Either Roselyn was renovating a different location than the one she'd shown me, or something was very wrong. When I called her that afternoon, she sounded distracted. "Hey, Sir, what's up? I went by the cafe today." There was a pause. "Oh, what did you think?" "It was locked up, no work happening. The neighbor said she hasn't seen any construction." Another pause, longer this time. "That's weird. Maybe Rico's crew was at lunch? They don't work consistent hours, you know. For 3 weeks? Look, Sir, I don't know what to tell you. Rico's been working on it. Maybe the neighbor wasn't paying attention." Her voice was getting defensive. "Are you saying you don't believe me?" I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. "No, I want to understand what's happening." "What's happening is, we're building our cafe. But if you're going to question everything I do, maybe this partnership isn't going to work." The line went quiet. I could feel her pulling away, and it scared me more than the empty storefront. "I'm sorry," I said. "I trust you. I just got confused." "Good. I'll call you tomorrow when I have an update from Rico." She hung up, and I sat in my apartment staring at that folded napkin with her sketch on it. Rosel's, our dream cafe. So why did I feel like I was dreaming alone? I couldn't stop thinking about that empty storefront. For 2 days, I tried to convince myself that there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe Rico was working inside where I couldn't see. Maybe they were waiting for permits. Maybe the neighbor really hadn't been paying attention. On the 3rd day, I went back. This time, I brought a folding chair from my apartment and set it up at a small restaurant across the street where I could watch the cafe location while pretending to read a book. If there was construction happening, I'd see it. I sat there for 3 hours. No workers, no Rico, no activity at all. Around noon, I saw Roselyn walking down the street. My heart lifted finally. I'd get some answers. But she wasn't alone. A Filipino man in his 30s was walking beside her, carrying what looked like paint samples and fabric swatches. They were talking and laughing like they'd known each other for years. They stopped in front of the cafe, and the man pulled out keys. Keys to my cafe. They went inside together. I sat there frozen, watching through the windows as they moved around inside the space. It was clearly not empty like it had been when I looked before. I could see equipment, tables, maybe even a counter. They were working, planning, making decisions together. After about an hour, they came back outside. That's when I saw something that made my chest feel like it was caving in. The man put his arm around Roselyn's waist, and she leaned into him. Not like business partners, like a couple. They walked away together, still talking, still comfortable in each other's space. I waited until they were out of sight, then crossed the street to look through the cafe windows again. It was beautiful. Clean white walls, dark wood floors, professional espresso machine, bistro tables arranged perfectly. Everything we'd talked about, everything from her sketches, but finished. Real. Happening without me. I called her that evening, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey Rose, how's the renovation going?" "Oh, slow progress. Rico's been having trouble with some of the electrical work." "Electrical work?" "Yeah, it's more complicated than we thought. Might need another week or two." I looked at the photos I'd secretly taken on my phone. The cafe looked ready to open tomorrow. "Who else is helping with the project?" I asked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, besides Rico. Are there other people involved?" There was that pause again. The pause that I was learning to dread. Just Rico and his crew. "And Maria's been helping with supplier connections." "Why?" "Just curious about our team." "Our team is fine, Sir. Everything's under control." But nothing felt under control. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Maybe the man was Rico. Maybe the affection I'd witnessed was just Filipino friendliness. Maybe I was being paranoid because I was old and insecure and afraid of being abandoned again. Or maybe I was being played by someone who saw me exactly as what I was afraid I'd become, a lonely old man with money and no one to spend it on. The next morning, I went back to my watching post across from the cafe. This time, I brought my camera. I had photos now. The man with the keys. Roselyn leaning into his arms. The two of them working inside what was supposed to be our cafe. I spent 2 sleepless nights looking at those images, trying to find an innocent explanation. On the 3rd day, I saw them again. This time, they brought coffee and pastries and sat at one of the outdoor tables like they were testing the customer experience. They looked happy, comfortable, like people who were building something together. I called Roselyn from across the street while I watched them. "Sir, hi. I was just about to call you." "Were you? Rico thinks we might be ready for a soft opening next week. Isn't that exciting?" Through the phone, I could see her talking to me while the man sat right next to her. She was lying to my face while he listened. "Rose, I think we need to meet. Today." "Oh, I'm really busy today. Maybe tomorrow?" "I'm looking at you right now." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then I saw her stand up from the table and look around. When she spotted me across the street, her shoulders dropped. "I can explain," she said into the phone. "I'm sure you can." An hour later, we met at a small restaurant away from the cafe. She came alone. I brought my photos and bank statements showing $12,000 in transfers to her account. "Who is he?" I asked before she could even sit down. She didn't pretend not to know what I meant. "His name is Marco. He's a friend. A friend with keys to our cafe." "It's complicated, Sir. Then uncomplicate it for me." She ordered coffee with shaking hands. "I met Marco before I met you. We dated for a while, but it didn't work out because he didn't have any money, and I didn't have any money, and we couldn't build anything together." She paused. "Then I met you, and saw an opportunity. I saw someone kind who wanted to help me achieve my dreams." "Our dreams? You said our dreams." "I know what I said." She looked down at her hands. "But I also needed to be realistic. You're 61, Sir. You're not going to be here forever. This needed to be sustainable." The words hit like a slap. "So you used my money to set up your real life with your real boyfriend. You wanted to help. And I needed help. I didn't know how to say no to someone being generous." She finally looked up at me. "I never lied about what I wanted. A cafe. My own business. That was always true. But the partnership wasn't. The partnership was complicated." I pulled out the bank statements. $12,000 rose, plus the extra transfers for Rico's supplies. "I know, and I'm grateful." "Grateful." I laughed, but it came out bitter. "What about Rosel's? What about our names together?" She shrugged. "It sounded cute. I thought you'd like it. And now? Now it's going to be called Café Roselle. Just Roselle. Just Roselle. No Ellis. No partnership. No us." I was being erased from the dream I'd funded. "The lease," I said. "The business registration. Are they in my name at all?" She shook her head. "I thought it would be easier if everything was in my name since I'm local. Legal stuff is complicated for foreigners here." Of course it was. I'd handed over $12,000 to someone who'd made sure I had no legal claim to anything. No ownership, no partnership, no recourse. So what am I? I asked. What was I to you? She thought for a long moment. You were someone who gave me a head start. A head start. 12 years of savings, reduced to a head start for someone else's life. I should go, I said, standing up from the table. Sir E, wait. I know you're hurt, but what? But you'll throw me a bone? Let me visit the cafe sometimes as a customer? I was going to say, I'm sorry, it worked out this way. I looked at her sitting there, young and beautiful and completely unashamed of what she'd done. She wasn't evil, she was just practical. And I had been useful. Yeah, I said. Me too. Walking away from that restaurant, I felt older than I had in months. Not just older, emptier. Like something had been scooped out of my chest and I was supposed to figure out how to keep breathing around the hollow space. The lawyer's office smelled like old coffee and cigarettes. Mrs. Santos was a middle-aged Filipino woman who specialized in helping foreigners with legal issues. She listened to my story without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. Do you have any documentation showing your ownership interest in the business? She asked when I finished. I showed her the bank transfer records and a few text messages where Roselyn had thanked me for my investment in our cafe. Mrs. Santos studied the documents for several minutes. Mr. Bradford, I need to be direct with you. Based on what you've shown me, you made personal gifts to Miss Mercado. The business lease is in her name. The permits are in her name. You have no legal ownership of anything. But I funded the entire operation, which was generous. But generosity doesn't create legal partnerships. What about the text messages? She talks about our cafe, our partnership. Those are nice sentiments, but they're not contracts. Did you sign any partnership agreements? Articles of incorporation? Operating agreements? I shook my head. Of course I hadn't. I'd trusted her completely. What would it cost to challenge this? I asked. Mrs. Santos leaned back in her chair. Honestly, more than you'd be likely to recover. Foreign plaintiffs face significant challenges in Philippine business courts, especially when the documentation is thin. You're looking at legal fees that could easily exceed your original investment, with no guarantee of success. So there's nothing I can do. You could pursue a civil case for fraud, but you'd need to prove intentional deception from the beginning. Based on what you've told me, it sounds more like a relationship that evolved in ways you didn't expect. Evolved. That was a nice way to put it. My advice, Mrs. Santos continued, learn from this experience and move on. Chalk it up to an expensive education about doing business in a foreign country. I paid her consultation fee and walked out into the Dumaguete heat, feeling completely defeated. $12,000. Gone. No legal recourse. No partnership. No cafe with my name on it. But the money wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was realizing how completely I'd misunderstood what was happening. I thought we were building something together. She was building something for herself and letting me pay for it. I thought I was her partner. I was her investor. Actually, I wasn't even her investor. Investors get returns, ownership stakes, some kind of ongoing involvement. I was just a wallet that had gotten emotionally attached to the person carrying it. That afternoon, I sat in my apartment looking at my bank statement, $12,000 poorer and nothing to show for it. No assets, no ownership, no relationship, no dream cafe. At 61, I thought I was starting a new chapter of my life. Instead, I'd just funded someone else's chapter while writing myself out of the story entirely. The napkin with her original sketch was still in my wallet. Roselyn's, in her careful handwriting. I took it out and stared at it for a long time, then tore it into small pieces and threw them away. Some dreams aren't meant to be shared, some people aren't meant to be trusted, and some lonely old men need to learn those lessons the hard way. I told myself I wouldn't go see it when it opened. What was the point? I'd already lost the money. I already knew the truth. Driving by the cafe would just be picking at a wound that needed to heal. But on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after my conversation with Mrs. Santos, I found myself walking down Real Street at sunrise. I told myself I was just going for coffee at a different place, taking a new route. I wasn't going to stop. I wasn't going to stare. I was just passing by. The sign stopped me in my tracks. Café Roselyn, in elegant script letters painted on dark green wood. Professional. Beautiful. Everything we'd talked about. but with one crucial difference: no Ellis anywhere to be found. Through the big front windows, I could see the interior we'd planned together. The white walls, the dark wood floors, the bistro tables arranged just like in Roselyn's sketches. The professional espresso machine I'd helped pay for. The display case filled with pastries from Maria's supplier connections. Behind the counter, Roselyn was teaching someone how to operate the coffee machine. A young local girl, maybe 19 or 20. They were both smiling, focused on their work, building their business together, and sitting at a corner table with a laptop open, clearly comfortable in his role as owner, was Marco. He looked up from his screen occasionally to offer suggestions or just watch Roselyn work. The expression on his face was unmistakable: pride, affection, partnership, everything I'd thought I was going to have. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, watching them prepare for their opening day. A small crowd of curious locals and university students had gathered outside. Someone had made a Facebook post about the new café, and people were excited to try it out. At exactly 7 a.m., Roselyn unlocked the front door and flipped the sign to open. The first customers filed in, and I watched her take their orders with the same bright smile she'd once given me over coffee. The same enthusiasm she'd shown when talking about our dream cafe, except now it was her dream cafe, with her name on the sign, her boyfriend at the corner table, her employee behind the counter, everything exactly as she'd wanted it, funded by someone who was no longer part of the picture. I started to walk away, but something made me turn back one more time. Through the window, I saw Roselyn and Marco posing together behind the counter while the young employee took their photo. They were holding hands, smiling like people who'd just accomplished something amazing together, which I suppose they had. The last thing I saw before I finally walked away was Marco kissing Roselyn's cheek while she laughed. They looked happy, successful, like people who'd built something meaningful together. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger required energy I didn't have left. I was just tired and empty, and trying to figure out how to be 61 and starting over again, with less money and less trust and less hope than I'd had when I first arrived in the Philippines. That night, I sat in my apartment and tried to remember what I'd been looking for when I sold everything in Colorado and moved halfway around the world. Warmth, I'd thought. Someone to share life with. A purpose that mattered. Instead, I'd found someone who saw me as useful until I wasn't. Someone who took what I offered and moved on to what she really wanted. Someone who gave me just enough affection to keep the money flowing until she didn't need it anymore. I wasn't the first old fool to fall for someone young and beautiful. I wouldn't be the last. But knowing that didn't make it hurt any less. 6 months later, I found a cafe I actually liked. It was down by the port, run by an older Filipino man named Felix who'd retired from 30 years as a merchant seaman. The place was nothing fancy: plastic chairs, mismatched tables, a simple menu written on a whiteboard. But the coffee was strong, and Felix didn't mind if I sat there for hours reading or writing in the notebook I'd started keeping. "American?" he asked one morning, refilling my cup without being asked. "Colorado?" "You?" "Cebu, originally. But I spent most of my adult life on ships. Saw a lot of the world." He pulled up a chair and sat down across from me. "What brought you to Dumaguete?" I could have given him the short version: retirement, warm weather, change of scenery. Instead, I found myself telling him the whole story. The move after my brother died, meeting Roselyn, the cafe dream that turned into an expensive lesson about trust. Felix listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I had something similar happen in Bangkok," he said eventually. 1987. Met a woman who needed help with her brother's medical bills. 6 months and $4,000 later, I found out she didn't have a brother. "How did you get over it?" "Who says I got over it?" He smiled, but there was sadness in his eyes. "You don't get over that kind of betrayal. You learn to carry it differently." Any wisdom for someone still figuring out how to carry it? Felix thought for a moment. "The hardest part is not letting it make you hard. When someone uses your kindness against you, the temptation is to stop being kind. But then they've taken more than your money, they've taken who you are." Over the following weeks, I became a regular at Felix's cafe. We'd talk about his travels, my work as a fire inspector, the books I was reading. Sometimes, we'd sit in comfortable silence, watching the boats come and go in the harbor. It wasn't the partnership I dreamed of having with Roselyn, but it was genuine. No hidden agendas. No lies. Just two old men who'd learned some hard lessons about trust and were still trying to figure out how to hope again. One morning, I brought my own notebook and sketched a rough design for a cafe while Felix watched. "Thinking about trying again?" he asked. "Maybe, but if I do, it'll be different." "How so?" I showed him the sketch. A simple storefront with my name above the door. Ellis's Coffee House. No partners. No shared dreams. No room for anyone to take what didn't belong to them. "You sure you want to do it alone?" Felix asked. "I'm sure I want to do it honestly." He nodded. "That's probably the same thing. I don't know if I'll ever actually open another cafe. The sketches in my notebook might just be therapy, a way of reclaiming something that was taken from me. But sometimes, when I'm sitting at Felix's place watching the morning sun hit the harbor, I think about what it would feel like to build something that was truly mine. Not ours, mine. With my name on the sign, my money in the bank account, my decisions about every detail from the coffee beans to the color of the walls. A place where I'd never have to wonder if someone was lying to me about receipts or renovations or revenue. Would it be lonely? Maybe. But I've learned that being alone is better than being used, and being honest with yourself is better than being lied to by someone else. Felix was right about not letting the betrayal make me hard. I still help people when I can. I still tip generously and listen when the neighbors need someone to talk to. But I've learned the difference between being kind and being foolish. If I ever fall in love again, it'll be with someone who wants me for more than my bank account. If I ever start a business again, it'll be one where my name is on every document from day one. And if I ever trust someone with my dreams again, it'll be someone who's proven they deserve that trust. For now, though, I'm content to sit at my usual table in Felix's cafe, drinking strong coffee and sketching designs for cafes I might never build. It's not the life I planned when I came to the Philippines. But it's honest. It's mine. And after everything I've been through, that feels like enough.